this is Tyla from the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, and you're listening to the Constitution at Work podcast, the series for people interested in constitutional matters and transformation in South Africa. Today, we will be talking about the adoption of the much contested Expropriation Bill and the broader implications this will have on South Africa's economy and future political and social stability. I'm joined by Temba Nolutshungu, Director of the Free Market Foundation, Piet, Chief Executive Officer of Sakeliga, and Chairperson of the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, Steward. Thank you to each of you for joining us this morning, and with that, let's jump straight in. On the 28th of September, the National Assembly adopted the Expropriation Bill after numerous civil society organizations voiced deep concern about its renewed legislative assault on property rights. They highlighted that the adoption of this bill would harm agricultural production and food security, future domestic and foreign investment, as well as other sectors of the economy, and consequently would put South Africa's future political and social stability at risk. Temba, what was Free Market Foundation's thoughts on this? Should all South Africans be worried about the Expropriation Bill?
Oh, well, I can just from the outset state that this should be a concern for everybody in this country because of the predictable, imminent, I dare say inevitable negative consequences socioeconomically. It is a bill that's going to set us back because it's going to send out the negative signals to potential investors, foreign direct investors and investors within the country. Because the thing is, the impact of the bill is that it's going to undermine private property rights. And this is something that looms very large in the thinking and the minds of just about everybody, not only just investors, but particularly investors, at a time when we need to stimulate investment in the economy because the economy is shrinking. The unemployment rate is above 50%. If one takes into account the fact that there are so many people out there who have given up looking for work. So this is very, very serious socioeconomically. And one thing also that I want to state is, it is a bill that amounts to nationalization because it would definitely render meaningless for private property rights. And those property rights do not relate only just to land. It is shares, it is just about anything that anyone owns. It's not just land, it's not just only houses, it's businesses, it is shares in various companies, it is investments that one might have. That's how serious this bill is. Now, it's also, while stating this, I want to say something also that has been worrying me, and this is the fact that in the parliamentary arena, especially amongst those who have been pushing for this bill, for the adoption of this bill, they keep talking about how this can be justified on the basis of what Saul T. Plaatje had done and had written in his book, Native Life in South Africa. Now, Saul Plaatje was the secretary of the South African Native National Congress, precursor to the ANC. And he was the one who had championed, against the Natives Land Act of 1913. Now, where the parliamentarians, some of them really miss out is the fact that Saul Plaatje would never, ever have endorsed this bill if he was alive. As a matter of fact, he must be turning in his grave. Let those who keep quoting him actually go through that book, which I have read many, many times, a couple of years ago. And it is very, very, very sad indeed that the ruling party has been contemplating this bill, is advocating it, and that it has found some receptive ears amongst various other parties, some of which are doing their best to curry favor with the ruling party. That is my view in terms of this. We do not need it. Now, the thing is, what I want to say also is, it seems to be a particular affliction on the part of policymakers in South Africa, that they have this uncanny ability to just simply disregard empirical evidence out there. empirical evidence is to the effect that if you nationalize anything, which is what this bill is contemplating, let's just be truthful and factual about it. Nationalization always results inevitably in shrinkages. Whatever is nationalized, there are going to be shrinkages, there are going to be shortages. Somebody once said, and this was repeated by Milton Friedman, the late economist, he had said that if the Sahara Desert were to be nationalized, there would be a shortage of sand. Now, that's being dramatic, but there is a grain of truth in that. One need only look at the event of 1989 when the socialist systems, nationalized systems, that is, had imploded. They had imploded because in those countries, economic productivity had shrunk to levels where people just could not take it anymore. So there is empirical evidence. And then you go to Venezuela, you see the same story. A contemporary situation, one looks at what is unfolding on our TVs, it is right there in our faces. And then look at our neighbor next door, Zimbabwe, what happened when they undermined property rights in that country. Look at what happened. We have over 3 million desperate Zimbabweans who are in this country. Now, I can't understand why it is that politicians cannot understand this. Policymakers do not take cognizance of this empirical evidence. For me, it is such an intellectual tragedy that this is not happening. It really is. I can't understand it. And the thing is, now, the other thing is that I understand about policymakers in any country for that matter is that they don't really care that much about the effects of policy. They don't really care that much. They focus only on what they intend to accomplish. And then the broader impact of policy is nothing that seems to occur to them. And so, but the point is, I can understand why there is that kind of mindset prevailing. It is because the people who enact policies that are proved to be detrimental socio-economically to people don't care that much about what happens to other people because they themselves are secure in the fact that nothing is going to impact on them, their salaries, their careers, and they will ride into the sunset with saddlebags full of money. They don't care about that. They're not going to be affected at all. And my appeal, given this, to South Africans generally, is that they should always, always, always focus on effects of policy. Effects of policy. Never mind what is being intended, never mind the stated objectives or objects, never mind that. Look at the effects of policy and then you will understand what is going on. Now, South Africans need to do that so that we can launch the country on a more rational socio-economic policy level. That is what is needed.
I think we can all agree with that, Temba, and undoubtedly there's going to be a major impact on the economy. Just going back to the point you raised, though, about this bill not only extending to land, but also to a movable property. Now, Piet, Sakeliga represents the interest of your members, which include businesses, professionals, and investors. What impact is this bill going to have on your members, specifically those with private shareholdings in companies?
The bill is already having a detrimental effect simply by virtue of being seriously contemplated for passing by the rest of the process, the National Council of Provinces, and for eventual signing by the President. The very fact that this bill has come as far as it has come has done damage already. Businesses compensate for risks like expropriation, and especially when it is formulated in the vague terms that it is in the current bill. So when you confront people like Patricia de Lille or others, and you ask them to change and make more strict the definitions or what exactly they mean by these potentially wide applications of the terms, then they say, no, don't be afraid. We only mean this for exceptional cases. But if it was for exceptional cases, the bill could have been written in such a way to make that clear. So the fact of it coming as far as this has is already having a detrimental effect. And I think it's important to note that it has the same economic working for both local and international investors. People say that this is detrimental to foreign investment. Sure it is, but it is the same economic considerations apply whether you are a South African resident or a foreign resident. Your capital needs to it is as sought everywhere in the world, and so it's not only for foreign investment but also local investment that will be detrimentally affected. Now, it's not passed yet, but every step it continues is detrimental, and our position is that we will never accept expropriation without compensation, even if it passes into law, or it was the same when there was a change contemplated in the Constitution. Our position is that such harmful change to the property rights regime in a country like South Africa is fundamentally unconstitutional and can never be accepted. And if passed, then we will forever, like many others, endure and insist until we can reverse that.
Thank you, Piet. Dave, any comments on what Temba and Piet have raised?
Yes, this is an action that defies any kind of rational analysis. The damage to the economy, to employment, to the interests of the country is there for everybody to see. And so the question is, why on earth is the ANC pursuing this? And the answer must be that this is deeply embedded in the ANC's approach of national democratic revolution. The ANC has been telling us for years and years that they plan to do this, that they plan to redistribute property primarily on a racial basis. The official policy of the ANC is radical economic transformation. It's not just a faction. That is the endorsed policy of the ANC. And the definition of radical economic transformation is a fundamental change in the structure, systems, institutions, and patterns of ownership, management, and control of the economy in favor of all South Africans, especially the poor, the majority of whom are African and female. Now, that's the definition. And this is the rationale behind this suicidal action. The question is now, what actions can we in civil society take to warn South Africans across the board of the dangers inherent in this move? Particularly, for example, the 8.5 million Black South Africans who own their own homes. The reality is that the value of those homes is far greater than all of the agricultural land in the country put together. The question is, how can we as society, as civil society, now warn South Africans about the impending catastrophe if this legislation goes through as it is intended?
So that was exactly what the head of policy research at the South African Institute of Race Relations, Dr. Anthea Jeffrey, said in a recent article, that the risk of this expropriation bill, the risk of expropriation without compensation, will not be confined to white and other minority groups, but will extend to the 9.6 million Black people who have their own formal homes, the millions more with customary land use rights, and the thousands of Black people who have bought more than 6 million hectares of rural and urban land since the repeal of the notorious Land Act in 1991. Temba, is this the case? Should all South Africans be worried?
Yeah, all South Africans should be worried. Remember, when a law is adopted, if this bill were to be enacted, it would be a law of general application. And so everybody would be affected. Everyone, Google it to Pontyville, Soweto, or wherever, Sea Point, they would all be affected. And it would be entirely at the discretion of the bureaucrats and the politicians as to which ones were to be confiscated first, because this amounts to confiscation. Which properties would be confiscated if one is talking about buildings, structures, businesses, or farms and so on. But if one goes by the populist rhetoric, the idea is to target primarily white properties, white-owned properties. And the thing is, this is why it really, really, really irks me. It really worries me, makes me mad. And that is, if you do that, you're going back to the apartheid era. It's going to cause a lot of racial tension, at a time when we thought we were moving towards a rainbow nation. That was just to be realized. That is a worrying factor for me. I'm talking about the rhetoric, populist rhetoric. Everyone says, oh, the whites that, and so on. I find that morally repugnant. It really is. But the point is, we need to move as far away from the past as possible by not adopting punitive policies that punish people for going back to the colonial era, going back to the apartheid era. It doesn't make sense. And so for me, the way I understand the EWC concept itself, and now coming, masquerading as the, to use this euphemistically, it's the Expropriation Bill. It is the same thing, EWC, that's what it is. You are targeting people. This is motivated by what? I might slightly differ from Dave, but for me, the way I see it is that there is an element of covetousness, of envy, of the desire to punish for the past history. And this is what motivates, it seems to me, the adoption, the promotion of this bill. It really worries me, because if you really want to move on, you must consider the fact that most of the countries by far were colonized by some other country or combination of countries. But those countries that are moving forward are those countries that don't just keep on looking back and punishing people for past deeds, future generation for past deeds. It doesn't make sense to me. That is why it is, for me, so morally egregious. It really is. And so this is very important for South Africans to know, that everyone's properties will be vulnerable. Everyone's properties can be confiscated, because this is what it is: confiscation, virtual confiscation. So it's very important for that message to be harped on over and over and over again. And for people not to put on partisan ideological binoculars when studying this bill. They must look at the bare effects of the bill. What's going to happen? It is so predictable. Everybody can see that.
Thank you, Temba. So the World Economic Forum just released its 2022 Chief Economist Outlook, which painted a dark future for the global economy. To your point, one survey found that 79% of respondents said they expected rising costs to trigger social unrest in low-income countries. Piet, looking at South Africa's future economic outlook, but also the call on major banks, retailers, property developers, and real estate agencies to come out strongly against this bill, do you feel that this would have any political pressure? Or, as Temba has said, do you think that the can is too far down the road at this stage?
Well, I think the can is far down the road, and it's probably going to go further down the road, but that's no reason not to increase the pressure against it. And in fact, I'm sure that our commitment to never accept it is actually shared by many in the country. And it's virtually impossible to not share the commitment. So with what I mean with that is, even if it passes through the National Council of Provinces, and even if President Ramaphosa signs it, the first thing that will happen is there will be numerous court cases coming. The court cases may be in anticipation of his signature on the bill, or it can be subsequent or in trying to interdict its implementation. Even if the litigation is not completely successful. It's possible, even if it's not completely successful, then it's incumbent upon all sectors of civil society and business organizations like us included to reverse its promulgation and or have it substituted with something else and resist every attempt at its implementation, at its invocation. So there's no scenario in which we accept the passing of the bill and its implementation, because it is harmful. And it's going to be harmful in an economic environment which South Africa and South African businesses and the public here can ill afford. There are global pressures, which we are all very much aware of, but add to that what's going on in South Africa. We're basically at production levels comparable to 1998. Recently, our team had a look at this yesterday. So industrial output in South Africa is currently at about late 1990s levels. And I see my screen has gone off there, but let me just finish the point here by saying that it cannot be afforded and it should be resisted.
Thank you, Piet. Dave, according to the 2022 Global Peace Index, political instability is now at its highest since the global financial crisis in 2008, which the authors of the index linked to rising food and energy prices. Now, political squabbling and the full-blown energy crisis aside, what will the impact be on agriculture in South Africa?
Well, one of the great fallacies is that this is going to help land reform. No rational person would be opposed to land reform. It is a requirement in terms of the Constitution, but it depends on exactly on how it is done, how it is managed, whether or not it will reduce our agricultural sector's ability to feed people, whether it will add to social friction. The reality is that right now, the average age of commercial farmers in South Africa is over 60. The number of commercial farms has declined dramatically in the last decade. I think there are now only about 25,000 farms left. 10 years ago, 57,000 farms. So what is happening in the agricultural sector is that farms are being consolidated. The biggest producers now are big agribusinesses, and South Africa is dependent on them for its food supplies. If those companies are threatened, if the present agricultural system is threatened, then we are going to face a huge problem with regard to food security. And this is one of the consequences that we have to consider.
Thank you, Dave. And exactly as you say, land reform is an emotive issue and it needs to be fast-tracked as a necessary step to creating a more inclusive and equal society. However, with land reform, what we have seen is that where, exactly like Temba said earlier, even in Zimbabwe, where land is taken and it's given to people who don't have the resources to run the farm and aren't trained to work on the farm, inevitably we will lead to some type of food shortage or agricultural issues. So will this bill do this? Knowing that we need land reform in South Africa, knowing that we have a Section 25 of the Constitution mechanism that provides just and equitable expropriation, will this expropriation bill lead to a more equal and inclusive society, Temba? Temba, would you like to answer?
Yeah, hopefully I'm not going to be off the mark in terms of how I understood how you phrased the question. But the point is that needs to, let me mention two things here that I think are very important to be factored into how this bill is to be engaged, perhaps by some other people, and also to be understood by other people in terms of its unintended consequences. I bring in the factor of investment, of the investor. If you are an investor sitting in London, in Germany, Japan, or wherever, and you are looking at the various markets in which to locate your investment, and you saw what was happening, what was unfolding in South Africa, namely this bill, which poses threats to private property, would you contemplate coming here, investing in this country? I don't think you would if you were a rational investor, and I think all investors are rational people. So you'd hold back and you'd look at other investment destinations that would generate more lucrative returns on your investment. That's what you would do. That's the bottom line. And no investor goes to invest in a country because of, well, I like the president. Oh, Mandela was a great president. Yes, he was. And oh, well, they did bring about a political miracle. Therefore, let me do them a favor and invest it. No, the bottom line is which market will make me realize the greatest returns. And there's a whole world out there, a whole world of markets out there. And this is what many people should always consider. There have to be policies that are going to seduce investors to come and invest in this country. And so far, there isn't really much at all, which is one of the reasons why the economy is shrinking, and also manifested in the fact that we have very high, the highest unemployment rate in the whole world. That's one factor that's very important. Then the other thing that I want to bring in here is the fact that there are alternatives to this confiscation of property bill, which is the expropriation bill. There are alternatives to it. Now, one of those alternatives is the fact that the government has acknowledged, and this is known, it has a lot of superfluous inhabitable land throughout the country. The government could easily deal with that on the basis of giving it, parceling it out to poor families on a one family, one plot basis. Now, across all races, or purely on the basis of who are the indigent on a non-racial basis, but this can be done. It is feasible. It can happen at no cost to anyone at all. Give out the superfluous land to poor people right across racial lines, meaning on a non-racial basis, because there are poor whites, there are poor colors, there are poor blacks, there are poor whatever of whatever color. So parcel these plots of land to all those people, and then the government can do what? In addition to that, it can lay out the infrastructure such as roads and street lighting and water, and that's all they have to do. That's all they have to do. And they will see the people rising up to the challenge on the basis of having, properly, legally titled properties that would have been given out by the government. That is what the government can do. There are lots of other alternatives. That is why it is my firm view that what motivates this bill is covetousness, because when you listen to the politicians talk about those farms, that big farm, and so covetousness and envy, and also a desire to punish the current generation for what was done generations ago by others. And so for me, this is very, very important in terms of how people analyze the consequences of what is being contemplated in the context of this bill. Very important. Expropriation without compensation. What's that? That's theft. That is confiscation. It is. That's what it is. Let's call a spade here.
Piet, your thoughts on this?
Well, one additional thought is that I think it's also good to think of some additional measures that can be brought to bear on government in either the current phase or subsequent phases of the bill or the expropriation plans. I've noted what both David and Temba have said regarding the motivations of the bill, and it's certainly part of the ANC program. So it's likely to stay with us in this form or other forms. And as the Klerk Foundation has pointed out in its own analysis, and we have and others have too, is that there are other bills like the Land Courts Bill and the Unlawful Entry Bill and others that all fit into a similar mold. So I'd be interested, perhaps, I'm going to give initial thoughts, but I'd like to hear what Dave has to say regarding international pressure that can be brought to bear on the South African government now and along the route. And I'm sure that there has been in the past. But specifically with possible regard to some of the treaty provisions that have been cancelled in previous years under Rob Davies, previous Minister of Trade and Industry, and Ibrahim Patel. They've been cancelling bilateral investment treaties. And then, but regardless of what they've cancelled there, you still have some international agreements like the European Partnership Agreement with the EU, and you have some World Trade Organization treaties that are in place. Our team is looking into how that can form part of the discussion locally and internationally against some of these. But I'd be interested to know if David has further thoughts on that.
Piet, yeah, those are very good points. And the reality is that we don't have all that much time now before this legislation is enacted. We must all be ready to litigate against it when it is signed into law. But before then, we need to get as much pressure as possible on the government not to move forward with these suicidal policies. And I think that international opinion can play a role there, but so can business. So can business and banks and organizations in South Africa, because this legislation threatens their continued existence. Literally billions, hundreds of billions of rands, maybe trillions of rands are at stake. Why can't business really mobilize its resources? For example, for a huge advertising campaign to inform South Africans about the implications of this legislation. What we need is a high-level briefing team to go overseas, to speak to the IMF, to speak to governments, to speak to investors, and warn them about the ideological roots of this, what the implications will be economically, socially, politically, and to ask them to phone the president and say, Cyril, please don't go ahead with this. Now is the time for that kind of mobilization.
Thanks, Dave, and I agree. Mobilizing the public, but also your international forums to try and get a bit more engagement on this bill is so important. Specifically looking at the mobilization of your general public, though, we have seen the rand performing quite weakly over many years and are not currently seeing a lot of interest in big investors in South Africa. What type of impact would it have on the economy in the short term, this bill? And I think Temba or Piet, either of you, if you'd like to answer.
Yeah, what I can state is, first of all, if right now, something that politicians, policymakers must understand is when companies, businesses disinvest because of hostile legislation, hostile regulations, policies, they don't write to Parliament and say, because of A, B, C, in terms of these policies, therefore we are disinvesting. They just disinvest quietly. And when you wake up one day, they're gone and the economy has imploded. But that's the reality. And so the government must try to, and people must try to empathize with the business sector, because the business sector lays the golden egg in terms of wealth creation, in terms of job creation. They must look at any piece of legislation in terms of, from the perspective of the investor. The investor could be somebody small in Gugulet to Khayelitsha. It could be a complex business enterprise. It could be, but it's important for policymakers and people generally who scrutinize policies that are being proposed, that they look at those policies from the perspective of those investors, formal and informal, big or small. And then that's going to set them on the right path in terms of that being the point of departure. We must not enact any policies that are going to have a detrimental impact on business enterprise, on the spirit of enterprise. That's something that's very, very, very important. Again, I want to restate this. Companies, business executives that are considering leaving, disinvesting from the country will not write to the MPs and say, oh, by the way, you've got this expropriation bill, therefore we are disinvesting. They will not do that. Now, there's something about that might pose a bit of a problem for those who try to understand such a mindset. And this is the thing is, the government has embarked on and dealt on a heavy-handed basis with the private sector, always. And so in many cases, or in some cases, you will find that the business enterprises, the leaders thereof, have got the tail between the legs. And so they tend to keep quiet, which the way I see it is just simply rolling over and dying. But the point is, they will just choose to de-invest to other countries. And right now, who has been collecting all our productive farmers? It is Mozambique, our neighbor here. No, Mozambique, on quite a number of flights throughout Africa and to other countries as well, where I've come across South Africans on the flight. And we would chat and ask, where are you going to? Why are you going there? They say, no, I've decided to go to Mozambique or Ethiopia or some other country on the African continent or some other country in Latin America, because the thing is, I don't see any future for farming in my own country. So we've been losing all these people. They have not been writing to the government. And the thing is, the government must really, really, really think very hard about the fact that they're considering enacting legislation that is going to have a detrimental impact socio-economically on the country. That is something that I think has to be restated, cannot be stated enough.
Piet, would you like to add anything to that, specifically looking at the short-term impact on the economy?
Yeah, as much as we think this bill is harmful, I think that the short-term impact will not be that significant. The reason is that, as Dave says, the writing has been on the wall, well, at least the ANC, this is official ANC policy, and it's been that way for a while. And what happens is when the signs are there, markets start pricing in risk. It's not perfect, but some of the expropriation risk in South Africa has been priced in. That explains why we are at such low production manufacturing output levels, why we're seeing the levels of GDP growth we're seeing. It explains why we're seeing a renewed exodus of skilled people immigrating, working elsewhere in the world. Despondency and so on, but a lot of it has been priced in. So in the short run, I don't think we will see any kind of complete collapse, not for this reason. I mean, other reasons like Eskom and so on are probably more pertinent in the short run. But to say that is that we are already feeling in the short run what has been priced in. So we are experiencing pain. In the longer run, it will be compounded, of course, and depending on the extent to which government actually rolls it out. So it's one thing for there to be an act, it's something else for it to be applied and invoked. And the extent of the invocation, I think, it was probably underappreciated in sectors of the economy. And as soon as we see the bill being invoked more than expected, that will, the bump in some of the indicators will be visible, sure.
We have touched on this, but I just wanted to come back to this because this is the provision of the bill that has got everyone worried in South Africa. It is the nil compensation clauses that allow in certain instances an owner who purchases land for resale at a profit or an owner who fails to exercise control over the land to be expropriated without compensation. Now, noting the Western Cape High Court's recent ruling in Kolani that held an occupation is perfected once the illegal occupier has gone beyond merely putting pegs in the ground, and Piet, as you raised earlier, the unlawful entering on premises bill, which offers occupiers the defense that they reasonably believed that they had title to or an interest in the premises that entitled them to enter. Dave, do you think we will see, as some have warned, a floodgate of illegal land grabs happening in response to this bill?
Well, we don't know. We can't predict the future, but what we do know is that more than half the population in South Africa are in a desperate situation. We know that if this signal is given that people can occupy land with impunity, as the unlawful entry bill seems to allow or make possible, then the danger of occupations, land occupations, becomes very great. Also, if we read this together with the Land Courts Bill and the idea that all disputes arising from expropriations will be referred to a court where assessors will have a bigger say on questions of fact than judges, and those assessors will be appointed by the states, then there is every reason to have enormous concern. And all of this is creating this situation where South Africa, a country with immense potential, which should be growing at 6 or 7% per annum, will go further down the road toward Venezuela. We've spoken about the failure of South Africa to attract investments because of this kind of legislation. We have greater mineral reserves than any other country in the world, than Australia, than Russia, and yet look at the investments we have attracted, the FDI we've attracted in recent years. Between 2015 and 2019, Australia attracted $280 billion in FDI. South Africa, with greater mineral resources, attracted only 15 billion. And this has one reason behind it, and that is that investors no longer have confidence that their investments and their property in South Africa will be safe. So we are confronted by an enormous crisis here. The government wants us to go down the road toward Venezuela. All South Africans who are concerned about the future, concerned about those 50% of our people who are living on the edge, we must all make our voices heard now.
Thank you, Dave. Piet, is this the same feeling that you're garnering from your members, that there's no security in their property rights? That's how they're feeling in response to this bill?
Well, I wouldn't say that there's no security. There is, of course, a significant degree of security in property, but the risk premium to all of that increases, and certainly with regard to agricultural land and land held for development purposes, that now becomes a different ballgame with some of these, not only the expropriation bill, but the others coming into play. That changes the landscape of what it means to be able to invade and so on. We were successful in litigation last year against the EFF, and normally we litigate against government. I'm happy to say that at that occasion we litigated as an amicus curiae on the side of the, I think for the support of the Minister of Justice. The EFF wanted the Writers' Assemblies Bill and the Trespass Act, the Writers' Assemblies Act and the Trespass Act declared unconstitutional. And had they succeeded, it would have created a very big problem. And so eventually we were able to defend most of the Trespass Act provisions and the Writers' Assemblies Act provisions. And this new land unlawful entry bill is an attempt by the Minister of Justice to rectify the one or two points that the Constitutional Court made that said needed rectification. So I think we've actually won some elements of this battle, and I know that Dave Steward and many others have been involved through groups like the ad hoc group for the protection of property rights against the expropriation bill. So I think it's also important to note, and I think property owners know, that it's not been that the government's been given a serious run for their money. And that's why there's still whole property, why we see development still going ahead. It's not like the economy is coming to a standstill, and because people are making a bet also that even as governments bad policy increases, they're also betting on civil society and business organizations being able to counter it. So it's a tug of war, and let's say we're all committed to making sure the right side wins.
Thank you, Piet. So the FW de Klerk Foundation believes that by working within the parameters of Section 25 of the Constitution and the mechanism that it provides for just and equitable expropriation, government could speed up land reform substantially and extend property rights to all South Africans, and that this bill is not desirable or necessary. Let's have final thoughts from each of our speakers on this. Temba, you can start, please.
Okay. You raise a number of points. What I can say as far as the FW de Klerk Foundation is concerned, in terms of what it is contemplating, in terms of litigating against this bill, this is very highly commendable, and I wish them success. And it is a war in which many people are involved in waging against this bill. And what I want to state is that we must do our utmost best to neutralize this bill, to get it abrogated. Oh, it's not even legislation policy as yet, but it's very much closer, to being that. But it should be resisted. It should not be adopted. If it is adopted, we're going to have serious problems in this country. Now, let me just add a statistic to to reinforce what Dave had said earlier on. Magnus Haystack, a renowned economist, South African economist, wrote in an article earlier this year, wrote to the effect that 650 billion rands has left the JSE. That's a devastating statistic. And that has to do with the wrong policies that are in place. Now we are exacerbating this situation by coming up with this ill-conceived bill, and it's just going to make things even worse than before. And we do not need this bill. We do not need this bill. And I want to prevail on policymakers to really think seriously about the need to factor into their analysis, into their thinking, empirical evidence as provided by various think tanks. There is, for example, the Economic Freedom of the World Index. There is the Property Rights Index. There are many others that can be used that are based on empirical evidence. No, nothing ideological at all. To take cognizance of that and use that to inform the policies that they want to see being enacted. That is something that's very important. There are numerous examples. There are still more examples in terms of what happens when such policies are implemented. Now, George Santayana, I think that is his surname, George Santayana, was an American writer, philosopher. He said the following words, let me just, to play it safe, paraphrase them. And I could be accurate in terms of what he had actually said, but let me say that I'm paraphrasing him. He said, those who forget the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. Those who forget the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. They are the lessons of history out there. They are bound everywhere in terms of what happens when you confiscate people's private properties, you nullify constitutionally, private property, and you actually implement that by actually confiscating people's properties, because there is no way that they can defend themselves in terms of retaining their properties. The evidence is all around there. That's just waiting for anybody to access it. We do not need this.
Thank you, Temba. Piet, your final thoughts on the bill and the broader implications on our economy?
I think that the bill is likely to pass the National Council of Provinces soon, and it's likely, well, then it lands at the desk of the president. He then has the option of referring that to the Constitutional Court for an opinion or to sign it himself directly. There's some variations that can happen there. You can sit on it for a while, or you can immediately sign. Whatever happens, I think we can look forward to a wave of litigation. And separate from that litigation from any corners, I am encouraged by what Dave says and inspired to make sure that from a business organization side, we reach out to diplomatic circles and others to make them aware of some of the problems of this. And I think that we could look forward to a great effort against this, even if President Ramaphosa signs this. The fight's not over. The fight for this can never be over. It's important to keep going. So we're all in it for the long haul, and let's take comfort in that.
Thanks, Piet. Dave, your final thoughts?
Well, I think that something that Piet said was very important, and we should remember this. We remain a constitutional state. We have independent courts. The ANC obeys the judgments of the courts. We must now use all of the rights and freedoms that our Constitution gives us to oppose what we think will be disastrous legislation, not for this group or for that group, but for all South Africans. We must use our right to political freedom to mobilize. We must use our freedom of expression at every opportunity to inform South Africans of the enormous dangers inherent in this legislation. We must use our freedom to approach the courts to litigate and stop this legislation at any cost. And we must remember that we are doing this to achieve the purposes and goals in the preamble of our Constitution, not for this group or that group, but to create a better life, a freer life, a more equal life for all South Africans.
Thank you, Dave. And thank you to Temba and Piet for joining us this morning. The F.W. de Klerk Foundation, like the Free Market Foundation and Sakeliga, will continue to oppose this bill and any other laws that contravene property rights as they're enshrined in the Constitution, laws that seek to abridge the rights of property owners and vest them in the state without any proper engagement or with an offer of reasonable compensation. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Constitution at Work. Remember to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to be alerted when our next video is up. If you had feedback on today's episode, please feel free to have your say in the comments section. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter at FW de Klerk Foundation to keep up with our latest news. We look forward to checking it again soon.